What's up, you guys? Welcome to Sector for Nerds, and welcome to another episode of Star Wars The Clone Wars Retro Discussions. Today we're talking about Season 1, Episode 6, Downfall of a Droid. Make sure you guys like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you could, head over to my other YouTube channel called Top 10 Character Moments and subscribe there as well. I'll leave a link in the description below. This episode was directed by Rob Coleman and written by George Christic. The cookie for this episode: trust in your friends and they'll have a reason to trust in you. So without any further ado, intro guy, take it away.
After a series of disastrous defeats at the hands of General Grievous, the Republic's foothold in the Outer Rim is in jeopardy. Commissioned to protect the strategic world of Bothawai, Anakin Skywalker and his weary battle group are all that stands between the system and domination by the droid army.
Thank you, intro guy. I will say, he did sound different this week. He must have a cold or something like that. But he's not the only intro that sounded weird in this episode, as the Tom Kane part of this episode just sounded a little bit different from what it normally does. Now, I will say, the thing about this episode is I remember still watching this episode for the very first time at 8 years old. And I just remember thinking, even back then, something felt different. The intro felt a little different, the music felt a little different, the animation felt a little different, and I think a good reason for that, and knowing what I know now because I have a wealth of Clone Wars knowledge, is that this was the first episode to ever be animated from the Clone Wars. So then when you think about it in hindsight and you think back to that time that you watched this for the first time, it's like, okay, so it does feel a little bit different. There was something to it. Now, I don't think all of the different in this episode was bad because I loved the music in the episode. I can maybe understand where people didn't enjoy it as much or they may not even care about it, but I really enjoyed a lot of the themes in this episode. Some of the themes I even recognized from playing the DS game Star Wars Jedi Alliance, which a few years ago, around the time when my channel started, that was one of the first big series that I did, and a lot of those videos, you guys, are some of my most popular videos on this channel. If you guys haven't seen them, I recommend you go and check them out. But yeah, the visuals aren't that great, but it's we sit there, we play through the DS games, we have a good time. It brought back a lot of the feels that I had from playing that game first time around. And there was so much that I didn't remember from the games because it had been so long since I'd played it. I would say that of the 6 episodes of Clone Wars that we've watched through so far, and we're talking about here on this channel, I would say this one was probably my least favorite. But again, that's not to say that there weren't things about this episode that I enjoyed. The space battle at the beginning was super cool, and they had talked about it in the featurette, Dave Filoni and Henry Gilroy talking about how they wanted to do a different kind of space battle because we hadn't seen anything before where you had capital ships going up against each other with there being an asteroid field in the picture, and then bringing in a bunch of tanks that are supposed to be used for ground battles, but you're using them for space battles and using them to ambush the Separatist. The entire time I'm sitting there watching through this episode for the first time, it's well, Anakin keeps saying we got him right where we want him, he's fallen into our trap, and I'm okay, but it feels like y'all are the ones that are getting your butts kicked. And then once Ahsoka invites Rex to the party and all the tanks, it's oh, this was their plan, this is genius. And Grievous's mistake was diverting all power to the forward shields, and the droid's what if they attack us from behind? And Grievous is so certain the asteroids are going to protect us, not realizing that the asteroids are going to be used against them. But it's funny because even though he diverts all the power to the forward shields, when the Republic ships start opening fire on the Separatist ships, they go down pretty quickly, even when getting shot at from the front. So I'm all right, clearly the shields on these ships suck. We get Anakin versus Grievous in this episode, sort of. We get it in ship-to-ship combat because, as we know, that this was a big thing that George had said, right, is that Anakin and Grievous cannot interact with each other. Remember in Revenge of the Sith, when Grievous talks with Anakin, it's he is speaking to him for the first time.
Anakin Skywalker, I was expecting someone with your reputation to be a little older.
General Grievous, you're shorter than I expected. Imagine if Grievous was just like, bro, I'm just trying to pay you a compliment, screw you. Like, I'm sure Grievous was trying to insult him, but one could argue he could also be, it could be a compliment. Someone at such a young age with so much intelligence. You know what, alright, let's get back on track. Okay, we need to talk about this medical room for a second. When we talk about bad animation, this, like, moment, like, this 20-second scene is the pinnacle of bad animation in this episode. Now, I was watching this episode on Disney Plus, and man, I don't know if they, like, fixed it up a little bit, because it didn't look as bad. Like, it still looked kind of bad. But I remember watching this on Cartoon Network for the first time, man. It looked awful. It's again like one of those things at 8 years old, it's like, oh, this is so bright, and like when Rex starts talking, it just looked weird. Like, it didn't look how like a normal human would talk. So I don't know, maybe they fixed it up since then, but I just remember like watching that for the first time, I was like, oh geez. But there were a lot of different story elements to this episode. You had the space battle, which we just talked about. You have this idea that R2-D2 is lost out in the field, right? Like, he got lost in battle. And then this other idea that the Separatists have a listening post and they have to go find him. We'll get to that in a second, but I want to cover the R2 stuff first. One of the things that this episode also explores on, like, a story element too is Anakin not being able to let go of the people that he loves. Or in this case, Droid. But we always know that Anakin has problems with attachments, and you can see that in this episode. Like, when he's talking with Obi-Wan, and you see him bundle up his fist, right? And Ahsoka notices it too. That's another thing that I loved as well, is just like when Anakin, you see the footage of like Anakin and Obi-Wan chatting with each other, and then you kind of have like Ahsoka just kind of lurking in the background, just kind of taking it all in. Again, like, she notices that her master is struggling, and she even stands up for him at one point too, because Obi-Wan's like, look, what possessed you not to erase that droid's memory? And Ahsoka's like, look, Obi-Wan, sometimes that extra information that R2 carries has come in handy. But I do find it interesting, right? Like, after every mission, they're supposed to wipe the droids of their memories, but we all know Anakin's not gonna do that with R2. And it's proving here that could be something that could come back to bite them in the butt. So they go to find R2, but Anakin has this replacement droid called R3-S6. He's black and gold. He's supposed to be an advanced droid, faster and more intelligent than the old R2 units, as Ahsoka put it. Anakin's just like, you can't replace R2. They board a ship called the Vulture's Claw. At least that's what it was called in the featurette of this episode. They don't ever straight up say it. And they don't ever straight up say the name Gha Nachkt either, which is the name of the Trandoshan, like, scavenger that's running this thing. I do believe they say his name, though, in the next episode, but this one I don't think they did. If you look at the featurette of this episode, it says his name. You look at the end credits, but I don't know if anyone ever straight up says his name in this episode. So another thing about this episode that is very funny is talking about the moment when the Trandoshan Gha Nachkt walks through the door and he just lets out this massive fart. And from what it's implied in the featurette of this episode, that fart was from none other than sound designer and voice of the battle droids, Matthew Wood.
Go ahead. You talk to Matt Wood. You ask him about it. Oh! Did I say it?
Of course he mentioned the fart, didn't he?
You put him on a hot seat about that. He'll completely deny it, and he's a very cool customer. But you can get Dave Acord in here, too. You can crack him.
That's not gonna be easy.
They were laughing about it. I was laughing about it. Not often does someone just let out a good fart in Star Wars, but this was just one of those times where someone did. I love when he compliments the R3 unit. He's like, you want to trade that for a C-14? And Ahsoka's like, not on your life. And I'm like, oh, hold on. Let's consider that trade for a second. Just kidding. Don't take that trade. That's a very terrible trade to make. You don't want a C-14. Even if you don't want that R3 unit, you can sell that thing for, like, much better money. And speaking of money, Anakin just, like, takes out his credits and just counts them in front of Gha Nachkt, which, kind of gets him to go, you know what, I might have something in the back for you guys, because he sees, like, oh, this man's got money. All right, he's good for something. Let me show him what I got. Another thing we get in this episode is assassin droids, which are, like, it's kind of like the big, like, ground action sequence that we get in this episode, because R3 activates them, and you're kind of sitting there thinking, like, okay, is R3 doing this intentionally? Is he just messing up because he's new to the game and he's trying to figure stuff out? Like, who knows? I do remember that I'm sitting there like, what are you doing, R3? And assassin droids are deadly. Like, every time I think of, you know, an assassin droid, and I remember even back then, like, at 8 years old watching this episode, thinking like, man, like, this is like that one bounty hunter that's standing there in Empire Strikes Back with Boba Fett and all the other bounty hunters, right? Because I remember back then, like, when all we had were the Star Wars movies and the micro series, and I just remember, like, watching all that stuff and just absolutely falling in love with that stuff and wanting to know everything about, like, each of the characters and the lore. And it's like, man, I wonder what this assassin droid looks like in combat. And we get that a little bit in the micro series, because, like, Dirge has a freaking army of them that comes to his aid and helps take out the Republic, or tries to take out the Republic. Here, it's like we see them more as mercenaries. I do wonder if those assassin droids were on sale. Like, if Anakin would have been like, can I buy these? And he'd have been like, yeah, you know, give me 1,000,000 credits. Like, I don't know. The Trandoshan did say, hey, look, there are some very unique items in here. But they take out the assassin droids, and then Anakin confronts Gha Nachkt. And I'm going to tell you right now, you guys, like, I honestly think that Anakin would have killed him right there and then had Ahsoka not been there. Because I think he knew, like, full well that R2 was on that ship. Like, he heard him and everything. When he has his mind set to something, man, like, he wants to just, like, push through no matter what. And Ahsoka's the one who stops him. Is like, Master, what are you doing? R2's not on the ship. He's not here. And there's a lot of moments in this show, you guys, that where Anakin is going to do something dark, and it feels like Ahsoka's there to stop him, which I think is very interesting, right? Because once you take her out of the picture, foreshadowing, it's almost like his character takes a darker turn. Coincidence? I think not. Now, of course, Anakin still had his dark moments with Ahsoka, like, even with her around. But I'm always saying, like, Ahsoka was always there to keep him in check. And then immediately after the Twilight leaves, we see our Trandoshan fella speaking to a hologram of General Grievous. Yeah, Grievous was leading the attack before on the fleet, and now he's here trying to get this Trandoshan to give him R2, and Grievous has been all over this season so far, you guys, and that was always the thing. Like, the first, like, half of season 1, Grievous is in, like, a heavy majority of those episodes. So then there's the third act of this episode, which is them trying to find the Separatist listening post, and they're trying to monitor stuff ahead of time. Anakin's gonna go out and scout ahead, right, try to see what he can find. He takes R3 with him, which proves to be his downfall, because, you know, he's telling him to do all this stuff, and R3 keeps messing up. Like, he turns on the tracking beacon, and then Grievous picks up on it and is like, oh, now you've fallen into my trap. And Anakin's like, let's hope Grievous didn't hear that. Ships pop out of hyperspace. Yeah, he heard it.
Let's hope Grievous didn't hear that. Yeah, he heard it.
But man, like, R3 straight up sucks, man. Like, he was like, he dropped the hyperspace ring, the engine's cut, and he's like, oh, the laser guns aren't firing, and he would have been dead had the Twilight not shown up. Because when Ahsoka saw the tracking beacon go off, she's like, okay, something's not right here. Rex, get a hold of as many men as you can. Let's go get them. So they bring the Twilight, they save the day, they pick up Anakin, and they get out of there. And Anakin's sitting there mad at R3. He's like, I know R2's still out there. And it's kind of like one of those endings where it's like, to be continued. This story ain't done yet. Grievous, though, man, like, he was like, launch everything we have at the one fighter, and the droid's like, it's one fighter, sir, he can't escape. And Grievous just yells at him, everything. More. More. They launched everything, and it still wasn't enough. Matthew Wood again with the comedy battle droids like, they got away, sir. And then Grievous just knocks his head right off.
They got away, sir.
The comedy battle droids never cease to make me laugh. Another thing that I don't know if this series ever addresses, but it's how Anakin got possession of R2. Because if we all remember correctly, Padme used to own R2. Like, R2 was one of Padme's droids. But if you watch through the micro series, you'll see that Padme gifts R2 to Anakin. I think it was kind of like a graduation gift, right? Because it's right after Anakin becomes a Jedi Knight. So I think that is part of the attachment as well, right? Is like R2, like, yeah, he's his buddy, but it's also that connection to his wife as well. And there is a moment, like, when R2 is trapped on the ship, we find out that he's trapped on the ship, and R2 tries to escape, and even, like, lets one of the assassin droids loose out of the airlock, and then, you know, Gha Nachkt finds them, and it's like, well, that was short-lived. And real quick to talk about the cookie of this episode, trust in your friends and they'll have a reason to trust in you. I feel like that applies to Ahsoka in trusting Anakin in this episode when it comes to R2. Perhaps. But the reason why I think that way is just because, you know, with a little bit of foreshadowing, with some stuff that happens later, and there's a moment where Ahsoka later on in the Clone Wars has to tell Anakin, Anakin, you have to trust me now.
I do trust you, but you know as well as I do that no one else will believe me. Anakin, you have to trust me now.
And I think that's part of why Anakin is able to put trust in her, is because she always put trust in him. So yeah, this was definitely a very unique episode. Again, I feel like it's probably my least favorite of the ones that we've watched so far, but it's not to say that this episode didn't have its moments. And I think it told a decent story. It did everything that it set out to do, and it leaves you enough with wanting to know what happens next. And speaking of what happens next, you guys, we're going to be talking about that next week. We're going to be talking about the next episode of the Clone Wars called Duel of the Droids. That's gonna wrap us up for today, you guys. Thank you guys so much for watching this. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others to help support the channel, and I will see you guys next time.
They got away, sir.